Hello, it's Modern Investing on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today we have esteemed guests. The new uh, uh, person today is Michael Remini of Toronto from the Remini House of Music. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure.
It's my pleasure as well.
Welcome to
And
your viewers as well.
yeah, and we have James Ead from Ead Foundation, San Francisco. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thank you for having me, Sasha.
Yeah, maybe Milan Asombrak will join us a touch later, who we hope he will be able to. So, in the meantime, today is Wednesday. Normally, Wednesday is a positive day on the stock market. Today, it's so-so. It's the Dow Jones is slightly above zero, and S&P and Nasdaq are slightly down. But it's understandable because they're all waiting for the decision on interest rates. Well, it's coming shortly, I think, around 2 o'clock. Well, it's non-eventful day, let's put it this way. So let's see how we are doing as investing is concerned. Jim, what have you done lately, last week, for example, if anything?
Well, Sasha, I just wanted to point out it was interesting. Last week, what I did was I checked on the year to date. The Dow is up considerably. The Nasdaq is up considerably, and the S&P 500 is up considerably. So, if you've been on the sidelines, I think you're regretting it. I think the market has been the place to be. But I looked further, and the Russell 2000 is only about what it was at the start of the year. So it's interesting to me when you talk about like a diversity, like how diverse do you want to be? If you got too many companies, then you're going to be pretty much average. But combining, as Milan would be, if he was here, he would suggest we.
I think he is here. Hello, Milan.
I just showed up. I just showed up.
Yes, I was just talking about you, so your ears were burning. I was talking about how I've noticed that the year to date, the Dow is up, the Nasdaq is up, the S&P 500 is up, but the Russell 2000 is only where it was at the beginning of the year. So I was wondering what you would think about this question of diversity. How diverse do you want to be, and which is more reflective of the U.S. market? The S&P 500, the Russell 2000. How do you make that kind of decision? And I know your answer would be the S&P 500, but why?
Well, yeah, and you also mentioned for the year, but for the day, SPY is down. That's the S&P 500 is down for the day and is down for the week. And if you take a look at the put-call ratio, which shows the investor sentiment, which is a fairly accurate way of predicting what's going to happen. And we tell our members to look at predictions for amusement only. Most of them are wrong most of the time. But the put and call ratio can be accurate fairly frequently. So that put call ratio now is negative. And it's negative because the interest rate decision from the Federal Open Market Committee is going to be reported at 2 p.m. today. Jerome Powell will hold a press conference at 2:30, as soon as we're finished here. And TD reports are predicting higher interest rates. And the market anticipates these things really fairly well. Right. And so it's reacting. So for the day, the market is down. For the week, the market is down. For the year, it's up. Yeah, and by the market, I mean S&P 500 or SPY. So that's where it is. So what we have recommended and what our members are doing is when the market is declining, it's a good time to be writing covered calls on SPY because it'll throw off cash. Even though the market is declining, the market as represented by SPY, which tracks the S&P 500, will be higher in the next 5 years, the next 4 years, probably even in the next year. It's got nowhere to go but up. So we have to ignore the fact that in any 1 week, we stand a 50% chance of having market losses exceed the premium income that we receive. but that premium income is cash in the bank all the time. The market will recover. And yes, I keep mentioning all the time about how empires have a 100% failure rate, but the failure of the American empire is nowhere in sight yet. So we can ignore the fact that the market is down for the day and down for the week and safely write covered calls on the market and keep the cash. Spend it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I've noticed that although all the stocks are on our documents, the trading statements and so on, but sometimes it's very interesting to see, for example, in the case of Mike Remini, all his investments right behind him. And, and they're all in a way unique and nobody can touch them from him. And I would like to ask Mike, you are for the first time and hopefully not the last on our show, I would like you to explain how the investments ideas will work with musical instruments, if that's the case, because if we're talking about modern investments, so we should not exclude other investment ideas besides stocks like, for example, real estate, and in some cases, musical instruments.
Now, before Michael goes on to talk, and I've known Michael for a very long time, I bet the insurance which he is paying on all those violins which are sitting behind him is greater than most investors' portfolios are.
No. No, you'd be surprised at how very reasonable musical instrument coverage is.
Oh,
It's something like 1/6 of 1%. So it's very low.
Wow.
And my collection is not as valuable. I mean, we're not into the 8 figures as so many others, as banks and foundations that are putting serious money into instruments.
Mm-hmm.
This is on a very, very commercial level, although I've never known anything about investing until I met Milan, and he's turned me into, has given me his education and turned me on to the SP 500 and all of this to follow. And until then, the safest thing for me to do was to buy merchandise. And by way of merchandise, when I talk about string instruments in particular, you're looking at a 2 to 5 to 10 year. I have instruments that I purchased 30, 40 years ago, still on stock. Not that they weren't offered for sale right away, but I wasn't anxious to sell them. I wasn't pricing them to be at the bargain end of the market. And I was very happy to just not show them to everybody, and I knew that the longer I keep them, the better they would be. Tended to be correct.
one of those behind you, one of those violins behind you, Michael, what's its value?
Those are the sort of commercial middle grade. That would be between $20,000 and $45,000-$50,000.
And it depends whether you're buying or selling.
That's for selling. These instruments are 19th century, early 20th century, and they were made as tools of the trade. They were made as instruments to use, not really for the greatest artists. It was not as the classical Italian greats, the Stradivaris, the Guarneris, the Amatis, who were making their instruments for popes and royalty and nobility, because that's who had orchestras and performers, and that's where they were sitting in repose. Then there came a wonderful period in the 19th century when these great instruments were pouring out of Italy. Italy was poor. Europe was becoming wealthy, and and music during the 19th century Europe, it was a huge renaissance, and these things were purchased not as works of art but as tools of the trade. It was 5 times as good as any average instrument. So they bought these old Germans. They were 5 times the price, but still affordable to an average, well, not an average, but a well-established musician, a noted musician.
Yeah, I remember George Bernard Shaw in his writings. He was saying that some violins, really good level mastercraft violins, they were affordable only to professional musicians in England. What he was also saying that if you would compare all the value of all instruments of English orchestras compared to German orchestras, so the English would be at least 3 times more expensive instruments
Yes.
than the German ones.
Yes, the violin trade seems to have centered in London, England. That is because some of the great established firms and experts were situated in London. Also because it was the center of all other fine arts as well. Musicians tended to congregate. No musician worth his salt didn't spend time in London. So while the great instruments were hauled out of Italy, largely through Germany and over to France and in Paris, the French never had the volume of trade that the British had. So the British bought them from the Parisians, and the huge center of trade. Then came America in the 20th century, and the same could be said for the American orchestras, where they were hauling out a huge percentage of these great instruments from England over to New York. And New York became another center of trade, and probably more important than England, as England was undergoing more difficult times towards the war years.
Sure.
So, and of course, America was producing the greatest violinists at that time from the Jewish European traditions, and great artists and their pupils. Of course, pupils flocked to study with them. And then came the next wave, which was in the late 60s, early 70s, Japan, having the money and the wherewithal and the desire. So great instruments were flowing to Japan, also somewhat to Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was purchasing state-owned great instruments by the hundreds during the 70s, 80s, 90s. And now the market has shifted. So to complete this circle of George Bernard Shaw, it's now heading towards the Far East.
Yeah, and maybe Middle East as well. Maybe Saudi Arabia will invest.
Who knows? Who knows? Well, the Shah did buy some Stradivarius, but probably no longer there. They've been torn apart. But right now, it's Taiwan, it's Indonesia, it's to some degree China, but not mainland China is not in the big leagues yet.
So you think that China wants to invade Taiwan to acquire all this rare?
Absolutely, this is where the great wealth is.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, 3 questions for you. This is a show about investing. How would you advise an investor to invest $10,000, $100,000, and $1 million in it?
$1,000 would be quite simple. You buy, I wouldn't say it's a great investment, but a hedge. Let's say a 19th century German violin, $1,000 to $2,000, and still around, still nice, and has an upward potential because they're becoming scarce.
I didn't ask 1,000.
There were
10,000.
hundreds of thousands of these things, and they were, of course, broken, neglected, destroyed. And when you take this $1,500, $2,000 older German violin and compare it to a $1,500, $2,000 Chinese violin today, it's night and day. Tone is different, feel is different, and well, the Chinese in the next, and they're being produced by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The German instruments, there will be no more of those. So that's one. Number one, next level is when you get into handmade.
I didn't ask about $1,000. I asked about $10,000.
$10,000, okay. Same thing, except that we'd be going up a category. A nice French or German 19th century workshop copy. An instrument that, for example, here is one called, where is it here? Colin Mazan. So it was a French workshop. The old man had his hands in most of the things that were made and finished. The son made it more commercial. He had more assistants, more helpers, bought the parts a little bit more pre-prepared. But a Colin Mazan violin, 5 years, 10 years ago, was plentiful on the market, and all of a sudden I'm having trouble finding them. I never thought that would come because they were made by the couple of thousands. So today you can get a workshop Colin Mazan for $10,000. I was buying those instruments 20 years ago for $500.
Bazin also made bows, didn't he?
This is Colin Mazan. Bazin was another family of makers. They did bows largely, yes.
Yeah, can you talk to us about bows? By the way, I bought them from Michael 30 years ago for $3,500. 5 years later, I wanted to sell it. He put
Yes.
hands for $15,000 instantly.
Yes. Very common.
So talk to us about investing in bows.
Yes, and you have $10,000. You can buy a very decent French, medium quality French bow, not from the great Parisian makers, but from Mirecourt makers, Mirecourt workshops like Bazin and Quigno Yuri and so many of the others. Plenty of them around. And if you pick a good one of those, but I mean a really good one, strong, well balanced, in good condition, not worn out, hasn't been left to go crooked and hasn't needed work and straightening too many times. So a nice one of those, again, the shortage of Pernambuco wood, almost non-availability of it. That's what I am buying right now. Simple, nice, straightforward bows, hill bows, English hill bows. These were the great Hill family of makers who were the center of violin trade in London. They made beautiful bows, and all of a sudden they've shot up from $6,000-7,000 a couple of years ago. I'd say COVID years, to $10,000 to $12,000 today. I'm talking in Canadian, let's say 10 American. So they are now edging up and up and up and up.
Michael, is it possible to use the same bow for both violin and violas?
No, it shouldn't.
Violas have a little bit bigger, slightly bigger bows, right?
A little bit heavier. Some violists can make it with a heavier violin bow. Mm-hmm. So they would have one bow for both. Mm-hmm. But it would be one that's a little too heavy for a violin, a little too light for a viola. But it can be done. I've seen it, and there are such bows. But it's separate. You're aiming at different professions.
Michael, what is, in your opinion, the major difference between a violin and viola?
There are jokes on that one.
Exactly, I have one.
Do you have one? That's
a loaded question.
Viola burns longer.
Exactly. So this is where musicians' musical training comes into being. Viola has come into its own as a righteous, rightful solo instrument with demanding repertoire. So bad violinists can't switch over to viola and just kind of slouch it.
Interesting that Mozart, he was quite skillful in violin playing, but he didn't like it a lot. And in most of the times, he was participating in chamber music,
Yes.
and he would play viola in chamber music settings, not violin.
Hey, Sasha, just really quickly, I'm glad you have this amazing musical guest on in the investment show because you know I love my music. And speaking of chamber, I used to be on our local chamber music board. It's the Mallarmé Chamber Players, and definitely have some friends in the symphony, and they even served on their board at one time. But Michael, I heard you earlier talking about a musician that my family has always admired, and I am a jazz head as well as a blues head. So I'd love to hear some of those stories if you're willing to share them about the legendary Oscar Peterson, because I am a jazz head, and Oscar Peterson was definitely very legendary in that space.
Mike,
He
what
was.
about Oscar Peterson? Michael,
Yeah. Sorry?
the stage is yours. Tell us.
Oh, well, I don't have too many stories about Oscar. He was a very private gentleman. He purchased his piano. He was always very cordial and very nice to me and to us, and had his piano serviced by us through the whole rest of his life at his Oakville home. He was generally thought of as a Bösendorfer. He preferred playing on a Bösendorfer, as many jazz musicians have. Today it's another Italian premium piano, the Fazioli. It has a tone color that's a little different from the standard Steinway sound, which the Steinway sound being a bit more direct and gutsy. The sound of a Bösendorfer was particularly good for jazz because it blended rather than projected. So it would reinforce and blend with other instruments. Conductors loved Bösendorfers, vocalists, singers, Maureen Forrester comes to mind. They loved Bösendorfers because it blended with the sound rather than drowning them out.
No doubt. Hey, Sasha, and I'm going to bounce off, let you continue with your investment discussion. But what is your thoughts about chamber music? Because like I said, I served on that board. I actually developed a great appreciation for chamber music, and some friends of mine were even doing some innovation where they were mixing various world styles using chamber music as kind of the framework. But, you know, that is definitely very intimate music in my mind and everything. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, it was so much part of our business. The chamber players, the quartet musicians, the professionals from the arts and sciences, but not necessarily professional musicians who would be playing in chamber groups. It almost disappeared, and slowly now maybe it's coming back. Home music making. But it sadly really fell back in popularity. I see it was 2/3 of my business 40 years ago. And in the last decade, I hardly see those chamber musicians coming to buy instruments.
Wow.
Sad, very sad. I don't know. We have a wonderfully active organization, CAMAC, Canadian Amateur Musicians Amateurs du Canada. They have wonderful programs all through the country. Particularly, they have summer music camps where young and old get together and play chamber music together. They have chamber music readings. When I was in my youth and playing 3-4 times a week in various organizations and groups, boy, they were very powerful. You could play every night in Toronto and get into a different chamber group. Gone.
Is it true, Michael, that most orchestral musicians privately prefer to play a quartet or chamber music?
They should. They should. It's so much more rewarding. I mean, more challenging. You can't just ride on the group of others in the orchestra of 12 violinists or 8 cellists. You got to know, and you got to pay attention. But what can be better? First of all, we as musicians, we love chamber music. Nothing is as rewarding. But now I'm playing along with my Bluetooth radio or something, and I'm able to pick whatever piece of music and performance and group of players and sort of play along. It's nothing like the real thing.
I know
Well,
many professional musicians from Toronto Symphony to play chamber music at home. They definitely prefer teaching.
Sure.
Because teaching
Absolutely.
is more profitable than playing chamber music. So you have to obviously consider that factor.
Absolutely. You do that for love of music. To sit in your orchestra and play along, your playing deteriorates, your intonation deteriorates, you're not giving your best. You're not.
That's so fascinating.
Actually, most of them are suffering all their professional life because they have to play under conductors. Some of them are not the greatest conductors at all, and yet they have to follow their lead and religiously play whatever they want them to play, and they're suffering tremendously all their life. And once they retire, they don't want to play any music whatsoever at all.
So right. And that's why so many of the greatest soloists and musicians turn over to become conductors at one point in their lives and saying, heck with it, they can't do a good job with me, so I'll show them how to do it.
It's a payback time, baby.
Well, Michael, I have to tell you that it's such a pleasure to make your acquaintance
Well,
this way.
it was a pleasure to speak to you.
And also to listen to your history. And the other thing, the history lesson that you gave us about the stringed instruments, but also the fact that I'm clearly hearing the artist in you, but you've also made a living at this. It's a rare combination of gifts that you can be artistic in your appreciation for the instruments. Because I have a question for you about this, about their value, because you're also, as a merchant would do, able to know what you can charge and what you can't get, what the cost is, the value of your product that you're trying to sell. And so my question is when you're selling something, are you thinking mostly about the sound that it can make, or is the appearance very important? And what combination of things go into how you would assess the value of a particular item?
That's a great question. And it ties into Milan's, where the 100,000 and a million and the 10 million come in. No. The rule is that if it's a fine, well-made instrument from choice materials, and it's in good condition, and as I say, made by really skilled hands, that violin will sound, that instrument will sound. If it doesn't, it's only a question of adjustments and setup. It goes hand in hand. But no, sound is secondary. Sometimes you find very inexpensive violins that sound marvelous, and that's great, and that's a fine. It's not to say that it's got the same value because of the sound. It's just that it'll make it a very desirable violin of that level. But this value is set by authenticity of maker, which is rarity, which ties into quality, because if he was a great maker, then he made beautiful and wonderful instruments. So the maker, the authenticity, the condition, and only well after that, long after that, comes into the question of sound, because sound is also a personal opinion. I will have somebody play an instrument and say, I hate this is garbage, you'll never sell this. 6 months later, he comes back, what happened to that instrument? Well, so-and-so, a very well-known musician, bought it and is performing with it. So it's totally a question of what you hear at one moment in your ear,
almost
what
taste.
you ate for breakfast and how much you slept, and also your taste.
Michael, back in my time when I was a kid, studying in a special musical school in Odessa, Ukraine, my violin teacher, he had a lot of people who were bringing him different violins, maybe to sell, or maybe he would buy or would recommend to his students or whatever. So what he did to evaluate an instrument, okay, he would look at it and ask about history of this instrument and so on, and eventually it would come to test. He would play first 4 bars of Chacona by Bach,
Yes.
and that would a verdict. Is it a worthy instrument?
You will know exactly that a great violin will feel and respond differently. You feel, you hear through your fingers, not only through your ears. So it's a feel and a sound. He knows that this is something of quality. He might not know who the maker is or the school of making, its exact age, and there are forgeries and fakes, because violins look so much alike. It was an open field for the crooks and the fakers, and because so little knowledge about instruments existed before the internet, and before you could click and see 20 examples of any one maker. Before that, most people never even saw 10 different makers' instruments in their lifetime. So,
Michael, along those same lines, because I'm fortunate to have a friend that is a Lutheran, or an acquaintance is more of what he is and everything. And I definitely know some people that are in the space of making organs, like the organs that you play, and all in that kind of way. But there are not that many makers, in my opinion, in the world. So how strong of a field is it? This is the investment show. So how strong of a field is it to get into and everything, and to make an investment in that as a career?
It's easy. There are thousands of makers coming on the scene, and a lot of good ones. We actually have a lot of good bow makers coming up. There are several good schools, and the path to learning the trade is you go to a school for 4 years, you then work at a workshop under a couple of good makers, or in a good established shop in a city somewhere, and then you strike out on your own. If you're then you over the time that you're working and studying, you get to handle great instruments, you get to make some conclusions, and then you know what to do with that piece of wood when you're working. And then you make a few bad ones, and it gets better and better. So many makers on every street corner that you could build Hoover Dam out of all the new violins today. And some of them are really good. And the ones that are really good are appreciated, and some makers are getting up to 6 figures for new instruments.
Michael, could you comment on the liquidity? For instance, this is an investment show.
Great question.
Yes.
$1 million worth of securities in a split second. Now, a friend,
exactly.
Toronto Symphony violinist, retired, sold her violin after a year and a half on the market.
That's about correct, yes. You will figure that if you have a great instrument to sell, to get the right price for it, and you know that there is a buying price, a selling price, and in between is the commission of the dealer or the commission of the auction house. Today, those are the most common ways of disposing an instrument, through a dealer or through an auction house. Sometimes privately, if you have a good enough name and enough connections and a network of connections, you might be able to sell it privately. There are enough guides, price guides, and records of prominent sales of instruments that you can pretty well establish what a maker's instrument is going for.
What about commissions?
Sorry, competitions?
Commissions.
Oh, commissions, well, it's what it is. I mean, I buy an instrument for, if it's $1 million instrument, I have a paper-thin amount, because I'll probably have to pay top price like anyone else to get a great example, but I can get a so-so example for 50% cheaper. If I can add value to that 50% cheaper and improve on that instrument because it's been neglected, it needs some restorations and whatever, then I can have some kind of a little space to work in. Yeah. But and it's the same. The auction situation is this. Buyers pay a 22% premium to the auction house. The sellers pay 20% premium to the auction house. The auction house winds up with 42%.
The house
Not
always
bad
wins.
at all. No dealer will ever see that.
Yeah, the house always wins. Hey, Sasha, you found another amazing guest and everything. Michael needs his own show, and I can say that as one of the lead principals here on the network and everything, because he definitely has a wonderful personality and all of
I
that. So
know,
I've
yeah.
thoroughly enjoyed your conversation. I'm going to bounce and do the production from the back end and everything. So whenever y'all close, I'll put on that video. But I have thoroughly enjoyed meeting you and hearing some of this musical conversation, because as Sasha knows, I love music, whether it is jazz, classical, or blues, or a number of other styles. So, Sasha, another great victory for you and all in that space.
Thank you very much,
Don't
Mark.
forget Funk, Mark.
I would
Yeah.
like to end the show with my great thanks to all participants, Michael, to you, Milan,
So
Gene,
nice to have met you, Michael.
and
My great
I want to
pleasure,
close
Trevor.
now because I want to still have something left for our next week's show. So therefore, we'll discuss everything what we didn't cover today. Next week, same place, same time. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All the best.